Keep Talking exists to have conversations that might help to make a better society and a better culture. As humans, talking openly to each other is one of the key tools we have to gain knowledge, to seek the truth, to foster curiosity, to exchange and explore ideas, to see nuance, to ask big questions, to defend individual liberty, to resist ideology and tribalism, to heal and develop, to glean insight, to learn from history, to change our minds. And in that spirit, I believe that each guest has important information and stories to share. This show is also a deeply personal project for me to learn, to grow, to reduce my own ignorance, to try to make me a better human being and a better citizen. And it's something that I want to share. Jerry Rosenbaum is a psychiatrist, a world-renowned expert on mood and anxiety disorders, and the director of the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. He was the Stanley Cobb Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard and the Chief of Psychiatry at Mass General for 17 years, from 2002 to 2019. During our conversation, Jerry talks about his career in psychiatry, the role of rumination in mental illness, the potential for psychedelics to help the suffering and improve human well-being, and the goals of the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. I admire the mission of the center and its aim to better understand what occurs in the brain when influenced by psychedelics. The research in this field seems to be gaining momentum and cultural acceptance, and the work of Jerry and his team is part of a movement that aims to increase humanity's understanding of the biochemical effects that psychedelics have on the brain. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jerry Rosenbaum. All right, Jared. Well, first, I want to just thank you for inviting me into your home. It's a pleasure to meet you. I know this was short notice, but I really appreciate you making the time, and it's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks. You can call me Jerry. Everybody calls me Jerry.
Will do. So I always like to start every conversation for the podcast starting with kind of the background story of what brings you to the position that you're in right now. And obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about psychedelics and the new center that was open, I believe, this year that you're heading up. Prior to what you're up to now, what's the journey, what's the pathway that led you to even be interested in or qualified for the position you're now holding with the center?
Okay, so there are a lot of years that have passed, so I think you want me to start closer to where I am now,
sure.
As opposed to how I got into the field of psychiatry. But so I was Chief of Psychiatry at Mass General for a couple of decades, starting around 2000, and kind of reached my use-by date, which was when I turned 72, I guess. And I was trying to think about what the afterlife would be like after, working so hard and long and building the department and then working in my areas of research. And as often happens, it was a patient who kind of turned the light on for me. I was just talking to him, and he was describing his anguish. And, I recognized it as severe rumination, that he was just stuck dwelling on things that had happened or regrets. And I recognized it as something that would happen to him when he was most depressed. And if we were successful in finding the next treatment regimen that relieved him, that noise in his head would go down, that he would get some relief from it. But interestingly, it wouldn't go away. I started asking him more about it, and I said, you ruminate. And he liked the fact that I had a word for it.
Yeah.
And then I started asking more of my patients, I said, do you ruminate? What does that mean? And then I found, you'd think after 47 years as a psychiatrist, you would, there wouldn't be anything new to learn. And then I realized that across all diagnoses, whether it's depression, anxiety, OCD, eating disorders, addiction, the main burden that people are experiencing is this phenomenon that what they're ruminating about, and the triggers for it may vary, but it's this form of stuck thinking, faux problem solving, that you can't get your head out of this loop that carries so much of the burden of psychiatric disorders. And then the irony is, we have this elaborate diagnostic system DSM-5 nosology, where we, put together what we think are the hallmarks of all these different diagnostic categories. And rumination isn't mentioned in any of them. Yeah. And so it sort of struck me that we were missing the point. And I knew there were a bunch of things that mitigate it. So all my patients were getting the same set of recommendations, to do meditation or mindfulness, to do exercise, have a good diet and good nutrition, take walks in nature. And if they have what we call an Axis 1 psychiatric disorder, like, major depression or bipolar disorder and anxiety disorder, if medications work for them to take their medication. And then the department that I work in is about half PhD psychologists. So we do a lot of very specialized forms of CBT. So all those things would be helpful, but never seem to really relieve people, shut it off completely. They just mitigate. So because I was still in my job and I could do this, I convened, a team of, the best and brightest from around the department, from, neuroimaging to cognitive neuroscience to psychiatry and CBT and others, and try to put together a task force to understand the biology of circuitry of rumination and try to find new paths to treat it. As luck would have it, there was a junior faculty member, her name is Sharman Ghaznavi, who was an MD PhD, who was really bright, had just had twin boys and then a baby girl, and her career was, delayed. And it turned out when she was a graduate student at Yale, she focused on rumination. Oh. And so we teamed up. We created a measure so that you could study rumination acutely. There were measures of it as a trait, but not as a state that you can measure change in. Started building a program around it. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is I have a friend who you might actually want to podcast someday, who is sort of an entrepreneurial guy, and but he's an influencer in the psychedelic realm, but he's also married to my wife's best friend. And so we would go out to dinner, and he would like to ask me questions about psychedelics, as if I, because I'm a world famous psychopharmacologist, as if I would give him answers. But he knew far more than I did, but he didn't let on. And I would say things, and he'd ask me questions, and I would realize that my assumptions weren't always, fully evidence-based. And so one day there was a program over at the Broad Institute. It was just using their facility. And it had a bunch of people talking about psychedelics, including, I think, a psychiatrist from Columbia, and some others who had a lot of experience on the underground, but also had a guest lecturer who I heard for the first time, eventually got to meet and become friendly with, is Robin Carhart Harris, who's a pioneering investigator in psychedelics from the Imperial College in London. Now he's at UC Berkeley. He's just, I don't know if he's there now, but he's about to be recruited there. And he had done some neuroimaging studies of people on psilocybin, and he was presenting the data. And when he showed the data about what acute changes and longer-term changes were observed, and maybe in an oversimplified way, it looked like when people were experiencing this ego dissolution, that there were these profound changes in a very important network in the brain called the default mode network. And it just struck me that people who ruminate are really active in that network. You see increased activity in default mode network. So in a very simple way, I said that we would do well to look at psilocybin in this population of people who ruminate. So the next step was trying to source psilocybin. And that led me to a much admired physician who co-founded Compass Pathways. Her name is Katya Malaskaya. And she just talking to her, I said, can you help us? We'd like to study this phenomenon of rumination with psychedelics or with psilocybin. And she was very supportive of the idea, thought that the company be willing to supply psilocybin for our study. And then she raised the question to us, could we think of something bigger? And, I'm sitting at Mass General Hospital, the main teaching hospital of Harvard Medical School, the nation's largest hospital-based biomedical research facility, over $1 billion a year of funded research just at Mass General. So, we're little known secret. So we have far more research than Harvard does, and it's all in this realm of working on disease. It's bench to bedside, bedside to bench. It's a credible resource. So everywhere you look, there are potential contributors to this question of what would you want to study if you were interested in psychedelics. And we focused on the fact that lots of people are using them, trying them in different conditions, and we don't really know what's going on in the brain. So I called people I'd known. Again, I'd been at the institution 47 years and had run for several years the executive committee on research, so I knew the research labs and leaders pretty well, and I just struck gold. So the first person I called was a guy named Bruce Rosen, who runs our neuroimaging facility. It's called the Martino Center. And his team invented fMRI, for example, and they build new tools, and they create all the the connectome and all these fancy new technologies for neuroimaging. Bruce likes to say that the Martino Center employs more physics than MIT, and it's true. So it's an amazing resource. And he said, I always wanted to do this research, to study psychedelics. One is because he's been a tremendous partner with the Department of Psychiatry in studying psychiatric disorders and is interested in that. He also had some members of his research team who were already doing some research in that area, looking at receptor binding and some non-human primate research. But he never really felt that he could come out and say, I want to do psychedelic studies. He sort of thought that might be controversial.
Yeah.
But maybe in my naivete, I just went ahead and declared it. I put I don't know if you ever listened to Mel Brooks, but there's a scene in Texas, actually, where he's interviewing a psychiatrist named Buck Murchison. And he says to him, where did you learn to be a psychiatrist or train to be a psychiatrist? And he said, Texas. And he said, University of Texas? He said, no, just Texas. He went out one day, I put my hand on a rock, and I said, I am a psychiatrist. So that's what I did. I just said, we are the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. Bruce was going to be the scientific director. And then I remember the first time I was interviewed by somebody like you or somebody else who said, how hard was it to get permission to start a psychedelic center at the Mass General? And I said, gee, it occurs to me I forgot to ask. But the president of the hospital is a fabulous person, physician, and has been a great supporter of psychiatry. So when I went to him and I said, he was fine with it. He thought it was, there was never any problem. But and then the next person I asked was the director of a lab in our Center for Genomic Medicine. He calls it the Chemical Neurobiology Laboratory, a guy named Steve Haggerty. And there was another, I guess it's kismet or something. But, he looked at me and confessed that this is a lifelong passion of his, that he had been reading this literature since he was a kid, that he had all the original books from Richard Evans Schulte's explorations in the Amazon in psychedelics and psychoactive plants, that he had always wanted his lab to be working in this area, but the same thing, he just, he thought that people would question it. Yeah. And now that we declared ourselves a center, he was definitely in. And then he brought in another person, a real neurochemist named Jacob Hooker, and then, my colleague and I that I started the rumination study with. And then I discovered at this conference that I went to that I mentioned before, one of my former residents that I used to supervise was a panelist. And because he had a lifelong interest in this stuff, and he knew every study that had ever been done, and he was a great teacher. So he became, and slowly we just built out this center, and it keeps being added. We just added a pioneering cardiologist who's interested in cardiovascular issues and psychedelics. Somebody in regenerative medicine who is interested in neurogenesis and memory, and it just kept building out.
Yeah.
So then the challenge was resourcing it, because although the NIH has started to fund some studies in this area, it wasn't an option really for us to get going. We had to raise money. So before the pandemic, we were really on track. The people who first inspired us, Katya Malaskaiva and George Goldsmith, who were co-founders of Compass Pathways, had a foundation that funded our first, or partially funded the first studies we wanted to do, and then they introduced us to a family who have been profiled in our development offices, new magazines and so forth. A very poignant and sad story of a family that lost a daughter and a granddaughter to suicide, and her passion was, or her motivation was, that she thought that she could be helped by psychedelics, but she couldn't source them anywhere. And in her frustration, during a dark period, she took her life. And the family wanted to memorialize her, and so made a fund at Mass General with her name, Ariel Susan. So that fund and the original gift are supporting my colleague that I mentioned that started with me in rumination. And our first two studies, the first one is all approved, just waiting for some space to be built out. And that's with treatment-resistant depressed patients who have severe rumination, and involves a lot of neuroimaging, really 4 sessions of neuroimaging and treatment with psilocybin. And then there will be a second study with psilocybin. And then we ended, during the pandemic, my aspirations of raising $50 or $100 million to create an enduring center, and I'll explain why, I was that optimistic, but kind of leveled off, but then things started happening. We got some of the labs that I mentioned have gotten funding from foundations associated with some of the bigger companies like Atai and other gifts, and including one to support graduate student research, a $2 million gift that could be matched in a couple of years if we deliver on the promise. So right now we've raised a little under $10 million for the center. So although it's distributed among several different groups, and more are joining, and every day more colleagues, particularly young residents, want to participate, and I just I don't have things for them yet, and I get probably 10 emails a day from patients who have heard about the center, saying, I'm out of hope. I think this can help. Can you help me? And I have to say, we just have a couple of small studies started. We're not legally allowed to treat anybody with these substances, and it's very poignant. Although some of them have not tried ketamine, so there's an option for them. So that's kind of the story. So we have this goal, which is to understand what psychedelics do in the brain. We're not there to show or prove that it works in this disorder or that disorder. There's plenty of that activity. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of companies that have launched to find their niche or their domain, depending on the size of the company. In the psychedelic markets, it's kind of a land rush. And, all the known psychedelics, the ones that people have been using for thousands of years, are being commercialized in different ways by, being synthesized as medicines or reformulated to be delivered in a novel way, or adding some molecule or atom like deuterium to the psychedelic to change it a little bit to create some advantage, to look and see whether DMT or 5-MeO DMT, because it's shorter, will work better than psilocybin, or whether LSD can be microdosed or combined. So there's hundreds, I think in last year there was close to $1 billion of investment, and with IPOs, many billions of dollars worth of valuation in this market. But we're focused on just trying to know what's going on in the brain, and from the molecular level through the network level. And why do we want to do that? Because we think if you do that, you'll be able to develop new ways to accomplish the same goals that people are seeking with psychedelics, perhaps without the burden and the history of the Schedule I drugs. Come up with new treatments, maybe even new ways to accomplish the same if you understand what genes are turned on or what nodes in the networks are critical to these changes that are associated with people's experiences with psychedelics. We might be able to, do it with other less costly, less burdensome, less controversial treatments, or at least even open the window on treating many conditions, not just psychiatric, that are brain-based, that we haven't been able to do before. So let me back up a little bit. Some of this has to do with, the whole history of psychedelics, the testimonials, the small studies, many small studies that have been going on since the 60s, and then obviously got interrupted for mainly political reasons. But the cumulative knowledge from that experience is all just extraordinarily inspiring.
Yeah.
So, but it's not the kind of data that typically allows you to make a lot of the claims that people believe are true. So you still have to be a little bit cautious in what claims you make. But the testimonials, everybody knows people who have had a life-changing experience, a moving experience that allowed them to feel different in their skin. It's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of some of the experiences that people had in long-term psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And to an observer, it's similar. It changes how you feel about yourself. But sometimes to an observer, you don't recognize a change in that person. It's, I remember one of my cousins, hopefully she won't listen to this blog, after 10 years of psychoanalysis, she just described how this has transformed how she feels in the world. But to everybody else, she was just the same person. Yeah. So maybe that may be meaningful. I mean, as a psychiatrist, you're really trying to help people feel better about themselves and within themselves, and stop suffering. So,
and you've spent your whole career in this world, right, in psychiatry, watching people suffer. And I would be curious to know during that time if, one, you were satisfied with the options presented to people who came to you for help, and two, if you had heard of psychedelics or considered it as a potential option for them.
So, the answer to your question may be seem a little glib, but there are many times when I was very satisfied. It sort of echoes what William Osler said about new treatments. You should use them while they still work. And so that may be a cautionary tale also about psychedelics. But, when I trained, which was 1974, I started training, the only thing we learned, the only thing residents were trained in was psychodynamic psychotherapy.
What is that for people who don't know that phrase?
That's Freudian psychiatry, or various schools of psychotherapy that evolved from the original psychoanalytic theories, about early developmental experience and how it shapes your personality, and depending on the defense mechanisms you have to use to deal with certain things that go awry in childhood, it leads to various symptoms. And it was a very elaborate theory that explained everything. But I also realized that it was kind of, I don't know, tautological. Not that a lot of people weren't helped by psychotherapy. Everybody, in some ways, people are. Human relationships and understanding and go a long way in helping people heal. But what I realized is that it never failed because, at least as I observed my supervisors who were teaching this, that if somebody got better during the course of therapy, it was because of the therapy. And if they didn't get better during the course of therapy and they stopped the therapy, it was because they didn't finish the therapy. So the therapy never failed. And so I had enough scientific training as, from undergraduate and medical school to know that just, you can't play that game.
Yeah.
And then it was mid 70s where, actually 72, lithium became available. And the antidepressants were available, but you weren't really allowed to use them. I mean, it was, I remember as a resident, I was evaluated a woman who had a 2-year-old at home and a newborn and had what we would now know as postpartum depression. And at the evaluation, we were not technically allowed to treat people. We had to evaluate them for 2 or 3 sessions, create a report, present it, and then the person would inevitably be assigned to a psychotherapist. But having had an internship at Denver General Hospital where they had a very evolved community mental health system. I had learned some psychiatry there. And so I started her on an antidepressant called imipramine. And because I couldn't send her home, without treatment, and she got better. And then when I presented to my supervisor, I was greeted with this, in front of my peers, this horror. He looked at me and said, "You started this woman on chemicals?" So for me, the old antidepressants, lithium, were magical. I mean, I could tell you stories of, people who had been misdiagnosed as schizophrenic, were on these antipsychotics, had all the neurologic side effects. And I took a history and said, this isn't schizophrenia, this is bipolar, what we call manic depressive illness. Started with lithium, some of these people just came alive and they'd come back and visit you. And so I had many periods in my life of feeling enormous satisfaction as a psychiatrist using these new tools. Lithium and then other mood stabilizers and the old antidepressants, MAO inhibitors were magical for some people, but they had burdens, side effect burdens. Not everybody, was equally burdened by them. But so I had lots of positive experience. And then I became a clinical researcher and was very active in studies of newer antidepressants, and they were like tremendous. When Prozac came out, I'll tell you, it was we felt like, surgeons, curing people. So the world, what you have to realize is that there are millions of people who suffer. And so any percent that don't do well is a large number. So several things started happening. One is that people who did well for a while stopped doing well. And we call that poop out, Prozac poop out. So anyway, the point is that with each new surge of new therapeutics, we felt that we had made tremendous gains and were really helping people. We created a psychopharmacology program that then differentiated into what's our modern department of psychiatry with, anxiety disorders and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and depression. We have 55 individual clinical and research programs at Mass General, all focused on either a treatment modality like neurotherapeutics or a diagnostic category like OCD, the OCD clinical and research unit. And each of those emerged from the early days of successes, and each one is probably the size of an average department of psychiatry somewhere else. And all of them have had tremendous successes. But as time went on, and treatment got more ordinary. Most of the easy cases, most of the people who got treated and did well were in primary care offices. And psychiatrists basically started seeing what we now call treatment-resistant or non-responders or complicated patients, or people with comorbidity where they have not just bipolar disorder, but panic disorder with it and addiction and so forth. So psychiatry got tougher and tougher because all the people who just responded readily to the treatments, didn't need to come to us. Often insurers, made that the case. So we started seeing more and more treatment-resistant population. Or people got more treatment-resistant over time. Maybe, there are lots of possible explanations for why it doesn't seem as easy as it once seemed.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier that I'd never heard before, which is that the idea that the through line between many of the major psychological illnesses that people suffer from, that is a symptom for all of those people, is a form of rumination, often severe rumination. If you could define for people, I think a lot of people have a rough idea of what that word means. How do you define that? What's a level? We all probably ruminate to some degree.
Sure.
Well, what is the level at which someone is reaching a crippling or mentally a designation in which they would be classified as mentally ill?
Right. If they can't distract from it. Everybody has experience of something they regret or might have felt humiliated about, and you think about it, but you move on. But if you can't distract from it, and you get anguished, and it takes a lot of your time, and it's associated with escalating distress, depressed mood, self-deprecatory thoughts. So it's stuck thinking. It's a repetitive loop. It's driven in part by trying to a feeling of trying to resolve it or get to a feeling of peace about it, but you can't. And the more you do it, you actually feel worse and worse. So I guess it is dimensional in a way. As you say, everybody ruminates. And saying when it's pathological and when it's normal, like everything in psychiatry, is challenging. And what I like to say is that, we all know day from night, dusk and dawn are a little harder to call. So, people know when they're suffering, and when it's so hard that they can't, enjoy life or can't function at work or at home. It's in the brain. It's a stuck loop. I was, Michael Pollan, who
Sure.
Is on our advisory council for the center and was our plenary guest for our launch event. And he really likes this idea that we focused on rumination, and that he thinks that this may be key to how psychedelics are beneficial, that they unstick us. You try to figure out what psychedelics are doing, and it's probably not one thing. For example, people have intense emotional experiences, spiritual experiences, ego dissolution, loss of sense of self. We know that there are these changes in brain connectivity that I mentioned in neuroimaging. That we know there are changes in neuroplasticity. You see this growth in neuronal connections and synapses, and budding on neurons and new dendritic spines and so forth. So these drugs are doing something in the brain that is encouraging something that happened that we associate with early brain development, neuroplasticity, the ability to change. And here we're sort of opening a window on it again in adult life in a way that we do see with the other psychiatric treatments, with antidepressants and so forth, but not as dramatically, not as rapidly. So the question is that part of how psychedelics help? But the idea that neurons are making new connections and are sprouting doesn't explain how something can change from 1 minute to the next. Somebody could have this experience and then wake up and feel different. you'd think neuroplasticity may be something that sustains it, makes it more durable. But why should it happen instantly? And for some people, at least according to some of the testimonials, or even in the studies where, you have 1, 2, or 3, say, psilocybin sessions and you're no longer depressed, as opposed to days or weeks of antidepressant treatment. So it changes your state somehow. It allows the brain to change state, to flip from, one form of connectivity among various nodes in the brain to another. And so that's pretty magical. But we don't really know. Is it important to have had the spiritual experience? Is it better to feel like you've lost your sense of self and you don't, no longer have what Freud called ego, but was in German Ich, which means a sense of I, yourself. So we don't really know what is accounting for this. And there's something to learn in it. So if you can open neuroplasticity in the brain, maybe you could target neurodegenerative disease, not just, emotional disease. Maybe there are opportunities for, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and so forth. So that's the stuff that we want to try to understand. Is there a path to knowing what psychedelics are doing beyond just binding to certain receptors and triggering changes in brain connectivity? What genes are being turned on, what pathways are being triggered, and then are there other ways to do that? There are companies right now trying to understand whether it's even essential to have an experience with psychedelics. So we think of it. You have this intense spiritual experience, or if you're using DMT, you're meeting robot elves or whatever. There are companies that have the hypothesis that you may not even need to have the experience. The drug itself might do it, and they're developing treatments like that might bypass the whole psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah. I love the quote you mentioned earlier, which I think you said was from decades ago, related to you should be using the drugs while they still work. Yeah. You're getting into this field later in your career, right? I mean, you were mentioning this before, that this was something that you, in the twilight of your work, were interested in trying to get into, and it seemed like there was latent energy there by a lot of people or were connected with, who were interested in trying to see, as you said, if there could be interesting investigations about what is going on in the brain and potential therapeutic options for people that you're trying to help. And I know it's early, right?
You're very articulate. You should be the one being interviewed.
Thank you. I'm curious for you if there's an intuition, even though the research is obviously not in, and there hasn't been the kind of emphasis on clinical trials that I'm sure will come eventually. Do you think there is that there is reason for hope, that there are people who are resistant to current methods of treatment that actually could really benefit from what you might be able to offer one day?
No, I'm sure that's true. And we've actually already seen that with a treatment that's available that's not, is not truly psychedelic, but has some interesting overlap, and that's ketamine.
Yeah.
So, the ketamine story is a bit different. I mean, but it was also a drug that was used, in non-medical uses. It obviously had uses in anesthesia and maybe pain, but it was a party drug. And although its mechanism of action is different than the iconic psychedelics, and it's thought to be more glutamatergic, it still has that neuroplasticity-inducing property. And researchers at NIMH and at Yale and other places began studying it. And it worked paradoxically, best in patients that other things didn't work for. So, for patients who were more severely depressed, had more anxiety and depression, which is typically a marker of more treatment resistant, and more suicidal. In some cases, it didn't treat the depression, but the suicidality went away. So we have seen this with molecules, that they can do things we haven't seen with other molecules. Now, it doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't seem as enduring as at least the testimonials about psychedelics. But we've seen that there are other ways to to treat people we haven't been able to help, and also works fast. We've lived with this idea that you had to have weeks of treatment with our remedies before they work, and now there's this interest in rapid treatments. So yes, I think from all the testimonials, the studies that have been done, smaller studies, mostly, although the MDMA PTSD study was a reasonably powered study, and there are larger studies going on. But I'm sure it'll give us a tool that will allow us to treat people that have not been well served by our current treatments. Now, the question is, there's a big commercial bet that psychedelics are going to replace everything. There's not enough room on the shelf for all the different psychedelics that are being developed right now. And people talk about it as a bubble. It's probably a commercial bubble, but it's not a therapeutic bubble. It will give us tools that will help people that we haven't been able to help. Now, whether it will replace lots of what we do, or only for those who are most refractory to treatment, I can't say, but they will be part of what future psychiatrists and others will be using to treat brain disorders of all sorts, but primarily behavioral or psychiatric disorders. I'm sure they will be in the toolkit. Yeah. Whether they'll be the toolkit, I'm not sure.
It's a center for psychedelics, and I think still in the culture there is this remnant of the hippies in the 60s and 70s when people hear that word. When you say that word, and specific to the substances that you hope to study or are studying, what are we talking about here? What substances? You've mentioned psilocybin multiple times. Is there anything else that will be in that category that you'll be researching?
We are researching other psychedelics. One is I can't mention because it's not one of the available psychedelics, and it's part of a sponsored research agreement. But it is a psychedelic agent, but it's not LSD, psilocybin, DMT or ayahuasca, ibogaine, 5-MeO, DMT. I don't know. NDMA is by mechanism a little different, but is often included in the list. I think those are the ones that you can access, even though they're Schedule I drugs. If you're doing research, you can access to study in humans. So we have proposals out to study MDMA and PTSD, as I said, with mindful self-compassion. We have a proposal for microdosing of LSD in anxiety disorders. We have 2 studies with psilocybin. We're talking to a company about a possibility of a neuroimaging study with 5-MeO DMT. So those are the ones that are in our I hope in our near future, or that we'll be able to do human studies in. The labs, the basic labs that work in the center, are focused on a variety of innovative explorations into other psychoactive, potentially psychedelic plants from the Schultes legacy, Richard Evans Schultes, who cataloged all these plants in the Amazon in the 60s and wrote this book, The Plants of the Gods, I think is the name of it.
Right there's 2 aspects, and as I'm hearing you, that I think are interesting. One is just the knowledge that you will gain and your team will gain over time in terms of what, as you have mentioned a couple of times, that the primary mission seems to be knowledge about what is happening inside the brain when psychedelics are introduced. Then there's a secondary effect or outcome, which is the hope for people who are really suffering. Given the fact, we're prefacing this question by noting that it is still early and probably not sufficient research has been yet done, who are the people in your mind, and you've alluded to this a little bit, that you would say, there may be hope on the way? You have these certain type of symptoms or psychological distresses and illnesses. there's reason to believe that one day there are new options that might be available to you to help you. Who are those people, and what's your initial intuition on what that might look like?
So the people on the horizon who potentially benefit will be the ones who are have the conditions that are currently under study in FDA-approved trials. So in 2 to 3 years, there could be FDA approval, or at least data that would allow approvability of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA for PTSD. But again, the small studies, testimonials suggest that the potential application of these agents is much broader than that. And then there's a fair amount of controversy about whether these agents should be restricted for medical uses, because there are lots of folks who would say that they've been important in their life journey, and ranging from feeling more at peace with themselves, and then even later in life, approaching death or having a terminal diagnosis. And those studies go back into the 30 years ago, of losing the terror of dying, no longer suffering anxiety and depression at end of life. So these are substances that can have a broad array of important uses outside of medicine potentially, and that may be what we see first, because it's the medicinal use that's being regulated, and it's the non-medicinal use in some ways that's being at least in some areas of the country are being at least decriminalized. And so there are those who are setting up retreats and facilities and programs to allow people to elect to have these experiences in a legal way, in a carefully managed way, just for personal growth. The term for psychedelics, or at least some of them is entheogens. They spark spiritual growth, and that's how they were used for thousands of years, obviously by indigenous people, as kind of holy or spiritual, or communing with the universe and nature, and so there is some controversy in the world of psychedelics about all this rush to make them medicines, although I think that's obviously important because they will be valuable medicines for people. But there's also this parallel push to make them more available. Now, you can live in a bubble. I mean, and I of people who are passionate about their commercial opportunities, passionate about their their availability, passionate about their use as medications. But there are still many people who, and they're not heard from as much, that have more cautionary tales about them. And I was surprised. I was actually on a TV show where we were supposed to have a debate, and because we weren't seen as advocating the decriminalization specifically or change in policy, we were just studying the brain. It didn't get to be much of a debate, but a very highly respected former government official and neuroscientist was issuing a fair amount of caution and saying there will be unintended consequences, the way there was when we were trying to treat pain and with opiates, that there are stories and experiences where if these drugs are approved, they may be widely used in a way that that isn't the case when they're used as medicines, where you're prepared for their use, you're carefully monitored and supported during their use, and you have a period of integration and of the experience after the use. That if these drugs are widely used, that there may be unintended consequences, maybe people damaged. When I was a resident, part of my rotation was actually an elective, was with a clinic that was seeing people with who had done lots of LSD and were suffering, visual flashbacks and other enduring consequences of overuse. So, that can happen. But compared to lots of other substances that we allow people to have free access to, they are pretty benign. The experience of using them is very intense, and we think there are some people who shouldn't use them if they have a psychotic disorder, for example. But David Nutt, a very senior neuroscientist, psychiatrist in England, has, to use his words, he says, when you look at harm to self and harm to others, these drugs are way down the list of things that we prescribe that are available: alcohol, tobacco, what have you. It makes no sense that they're Schedule 1. The Schedule 1 means they have no value at all. And we already know enough to know that's not the case.
I'm glad you brought up the potential downside risk here, because I'd like you to speak to that a little bit. Who, in your judgment, given we're sitting here talking in 2021, given your knowledge, given your assessment, what is the appropriate setting for taking these substances generally, and who, you alluded to this briefly, who really should think hard about whether they should take it, or really in your mind should not be taking these substances?
So going back to what I said about how these substances open a window, allowing the brain to change neuroplasticity, that's neutral. It doesn't mean that you're going to have positive growth, or you could have negative. We think of PTSD as a consequence of a window of neuroplasticity that opens in the face of trauma or sustained threat. Your brain has to learn quickly when your life's in danger. And so, one model of PTSD is that, why it becomes so enduring is that, it's trauma induces neuroplasticity, and you learn dramatically to fear. And so if it's neuroplasticity, and you're in the wrong setting, or you're not well prepared, I suppose it could be a traumatic experience, so that's one issue. It's an intense emotional experience. Not everybody is, may be happy to feel that they don't exist as an individual person for a while. But it's hard to get good documentation of how often that happens. We have seen people who have had described them as, one of the most challenging or difficult or terrifying experiences. But they'll often say that, the net of the experience was a benefit. Yeah. So it's hard to know, what the potential damage is. The caution is that we don't give them to people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or any psychotic disorder. That's more just practice than something we know well. It's caution. It's possible that in the right context, at the right time, and the right dose, that they may not be harmful. But as with anything, there's a need for moderation. We know with MDMA that if you use it too many times, you could damage your heart valve, probably. A heart valve, it's a 5-HT2 receptor binder, like a drug called fenfluramine. The FDA limits the number of times you're allowed to, if you're in a study, to have had MDMA. So they're just unknowns. I can't really tell you any data that I know of populations that we know will be harmed or what the harm is. But I think we know from other drug class experiences that before you know a lot, you have to be cautious. This is why we really want to know what's happening in the brain. People aren't that interested in the science. They're interested in their availability, their access, their commercial value. But we think this is an essential part of the story that, if we understand what is happening, it may amplify, the progress of access, that people will understand it in a way that will reduce the fear or the legacy of association with, depending on who you are, counterculture, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah.
But I think we just need to know what is happening in the brain. Now, it's possible you might learn something that would be a setback, and maybe that's why people aren't rushing to fund this science. But my guess is that it will lead us to new approaches, new tools, new molecules, new therapies that will replace the psychedelics that are being studied now in the same way we replace the old tricyclic antidepressants with newer antidepressants, just because they are more convenient to use, or they are more tolerable, or they work more efficiently. So I mean, that's the hope of what our center is engaged in.
Yeah. You noted a couple anecdotes. One you've spoken about a couple times. I think a patient that you noted earlier who had severe rumination and told a little bit about her story. But then you also mentioned, I think you said it was your wife's best friend's husband who you had dinner with, who it seemed like that was a kind of a formative time for you in terms of your shift in thinking about these a little bit more seriously. What did you learn from those conversations? What information got you really clued into the fact that there might be something there?
Yeah, well, it was remarkable to think of oneself as an expert and realize there's this huge gap in knowledge.
Yeah.
You make a lot of assumptions. And then if you dig deep, you find that there's really substance there. I mean, even going back to the work that was done in the 60s and maybe early 70s around treating alcoholism with LSD, there were a lot of very serious, smart people who saw real promise in these agents. And it just got buried. It wasn't even very much part of our training to know about that history. So it was like rediscovering something. It was like buried treasure in a way.
Yeah.
And it took a person with no medical training to very graciously but systematically to exploit me. I think he knew. That somebody compiled a list of the top 100 influencers in psychedelic world, and he's on that list.
Wow.
And he's chair of our advisory council now. And he had been working very hard, bringing support to other groups as well, to bring philanthropic support to other science. I think he knew that this was that having a center here would be a boost to the cause. Mm-hmm. But I think there also he's serious about what we need to learn, that there is a big gap in the science, that if that gap is addressed, that what he thinks is going to be important for mankind, will be facilitated. I mean, if you've ever heard Rick Doblin speak,
sure.
While he's developing MDMA as a medication for PTSD, and has had his group is published in a very significant journal in Nature Medicine, their phase 3 study. If you have a chance to listen to him, he's talking not just about a medication for a psychiatric disorder, but a tool that he hopes will change the course of humanity.
Yeah.
That bring an end to the way we can hate each other, and bring an end to the kind of loathing and despair that underpins so much of human chaos, and now maybe the uncertainty about the future of humanity. I mean, he talks in those terms. Yeah. That if people had access to these things, they've changed their attitudes. They'd connect more with nature and the world and with each other. MDMA in particular, as an empathogen, I refer to the psychedelics as entheogens. Empathogens is it creates a more warmth and connectivity with self and others, which is possibly why it works in PTSD. You have now compassion for yourself and what you've been through in a way that allows you to forgive yourself as you permit others to forgive you and connect. So that's a whole nother dimension of how some of these pioneers who labored, in the darkness all these decades while fighting to bring these substances back into consideration for their value.
He's been at this for decades. I think since the 80s, mid 80s, or maybe even before then.
Even before, yeah.
I've heard him say in a previous interview that a formative experience for him was a dream he had when he was a young man from ancestors of his who had died in the Holocaust, who came to him in a dream and said, "You are here. This is kind of your purpose. This is, you are here to bring this to humanity, or to help to try to bring this to humanity."
He talks about the Holocaust as a big theme in why he thinks it's essential that humanity have access to these experiences.
Yeah. The friend that you mentioned before, and I'm going to go back to him. Were there anecdotes that he mentioned to you, or books that he recommended that to you? I don't know your perception of psychedelics had been prior to that time. If you thought that they were, kind of foolish, pleasure-driven options for people, but was he familiar with studies that really got you thinking differently about the possibilities there?
He could cite studies, not the way my young colleague could, but he knew some of the literature. He had read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and gave it to me, and then I read it, and that helped.
Yeah.
I guess I could confess to being an ignoramus. I was vaguely aware, of some of the work with alcoholism, with LSD. I obviously, as we all did, knew people who would use psychedelics for the experience and pleasure and liked them. But, it's a little different to be using them for the experience and be using them in a targeted way to address something very painful, and to do that in the way psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is designed. Those who are advancing psychedelics through traditional approval mechanisms are not in fact developing them as traditional drugs. It's not like we're trying to approve psilocybin for depression or MDMA for PTSD. These are psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Very careful to say it's the psychotherapy and that it's the drug that is facilitating the therapy. So I think I mentioned before, it's for each session of MDMA or each session of psilocybin, it's 2 therapists with 8 hours of preparation, 8 hours during the experience, and 8 hours for the post-experience integration. That's 24 hours times 2 of therapy. Now, when you actually look at the therapy that's being delivered, it's the closest thing you come to is, support, or even something like Rogerian therapy, where it's more reflective backed. What are you experiencing? Tell me more, kind of thing. Go with it. It's not, highly developed conceptual therapy like psychoanalysis or something, but it is still considered a therapeutic intervention, and programs are in place to train people to do it that are quite extensive. Many hours of training, including lots of observation of the experience. So it's being developed as a psychotherapy or a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which is going to be a challenge because it's going to make it less accessible for many people, because having that kind of costly and difficult to deliver and to train people to provide therapy will slow the access to these treatments.
Where are we right now with the efficacy of these treatments? The devil's always in the details related to new medical options for patients. It's great to have a wide array of tools to provide to people to potentially help them, but What are the early signals that you're seeing in these in the substances in terms of helping people with, for example, PTSD, depression, alcoholism? How helpful does it seem that these are for people?
Well, the testimonials are dramatic. The data are interesting and create a feeling of optimism. But let me play skeptic for a second.
Yeah, please.
The studies that are done are often the subjects are very enthusiastic, have tried very hard to have access to the study, so they're really motivated.
Yeah.
The sites where these studies are done, the principal investigators tend to be people who have invested heavily in this space and believe deeply in it. It's impossible to blind the experience.
Yeah.
So it's a setup for very positive conclusions that, if you were able to control in other ways, may be more daunting to prove. We've seen this in psychiatry all the time. The challenge of doing clinical trials with these heterogeneous populations of people who have, who vary so much in their ability to respond to these agents. The studies are very complicated to do. A lot of subjects don't comply with studies and aren't taking the medicine. So it's very hard to get signals in psychiatric clinical trials. My career has been trying to find new ways to treat things, new combinations of treatments using old drugs in novel ways to try to use nutraceuticals and complementary and alternative medicines and other things to try to get more people to respond to treatment. And time after time, I've had remarkable success, only to be defeated when I tried to prove it in a clinical trial, which doesn't mean they didn't work. It just means they work for some people. And then when you try to gather people to be volunteers in studies, you can go lots of different ways. So, for example, the trial with psilocybin versus traditional antidepressant, escitalopram, that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year. Depends on how you read it, but the conclusions say that the psilocybin performed no better than escitalopram, an SSRI. Now, if you look deeper into the data, you can find lots of signals that say, well, that's just because of the rules of clinical trial statistical analysis. It didn't separate statistically. But on every measure, psilocybin looked better. But again, it was at a site that's, focuses on psychedelics. All the people who had been in the study had experience with psychedelics. And they screened 1,000 patients, 1,000 subjects to get 59 patients. So how generalizable is it? Did that really prove that how much better these substances will be? Now, with escitalopram, you have to take it every day, and you have to take it for weeks and months, and maybe years. And the idea behind the psychedelics is that with 3 sessions, something changes, and you might have a durable benefit. So even if they were equal in that study, it still might argue that the psychedelics had the advantage. But still, it's hard. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to show in a clinical trial what people are reporting in small open studies and testimonials.
I want to ask you a few final questions. The first being, people who listen to this, and just in listening to you speak about how quickly this sounds like a startup getting put together, with some very capable and talented people, some of whom it sounds like you've known for a while. For individuals who listen to this or hear about the organization, whether they're PhDs, doctors, investors, what's the best way that people can help at this point?
Well, I mean that's like a soft pitch. I think for us we're counting on philanthropy right now. And so we think that people who are already made tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in this space owe it to everybody else to advance the science. I mean, it doesn't have to be Mass General. It could be UCSF. It could be Yale. It could be NYU. It could be Hopkins. But they people who have the capacity to advance the science until such time as there are other mechanisms, foundations and NIH that can advance this work. I mean, I think they really have to come to the table and find their favorite center or scientist or approach and fund that. For everybody else, those I feel most regretful for are the number of people who are so hopeful right now, with all the news about it, who are having trouble getting access. I mean, there are those who find the underground and get treatment, but I hear a lot from people in the city and people who don't have the means or the connections, who are desperate to try something new, who for one reason or another feel that the current medical treatment has failed them. Now, there's no guarantee this will work for them either. Sure. But the idea that we can't help them unless they qualify for a small study, for years to come, and even then, whether their insurance or anybody will make it available to them. So I just think we need advocacy. We need more support for the science. Everybody can advocate. Everybody can work to make sure that the legacy of criminalizing and making Schedule I these agents don't hold us back, because holding us back is keeping people suffering unnecessarily for a longer period of time.
I'm glad you brought this up and I don't even know that there is a good answer here, but for the people who are listening to this or are learning about psychedelics, who are treatment resistant and are desperate. I mean, it sounds like you're hearing from a lot of these people who just learn about what you do and reach out to you because they're at the end of the rope and they would like some hope in their life. What do you say to people now? I mean, hopefully this becomes more and more widely available over time as a potential option. I think you've been fair-minded in articulating the fact that these are not necessarily silver bullets. It's not a guarantee. But what do you say to people who reach out to you, who do need help now or would like help now desperately?
So there's a small subgroup of those who probably do qualify for our study and will be able to at least get a one session of treatment with psilocybin during our imaging study. For those with other conditions where I know that there are studies elsewhere, I will mention to them. So, for example, I hear from people with severe OCD, and I know there was a study at Yale, so I might mention that. For others, if they haven't tried ketamine, I suggest that that's probably the closest they'll be able to come to a treatment that can work for treatment-resistant patients for a variety of conditions that has some of the elements of a psychedelic like.
Ketamine is legal, right? I mean, that's accessible to Americans.
Is approved. A form of ketamine is approved for treatment of treatment-resistant depression, but ketamine itself is a generic medicine that any doctor can prescribe.
Yeah.
There are lots of ketamine clinics and individual offices that provide ketamine treatment for depressed patients and even for other conditions. It may have some benefit, maybe even for PTSD, some hint there as well, but certainly for depression, severe depression, suicidal depression, anxious depression. So there are practitioners who use ketamine now in an analogous way to psychedelics in what's called ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So often then they're not doing infusions of ketamine as ketamine centers or ketamine clinics do, but with lozenges or intramuscular administration. And then during the window of time, not necessarily when someone's having the dissociative state that goes with ketamine, but in the window of time afterwards, the same theory that there's an opportunity for change involving the increased neuroplasticity that ketamine creates, that therapy may be more beneficial and people can make gains that would be harder without it. So ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is becoming a thing, in addition to ketamine infusions, which are typically for more severely ill patients.
So this is primarily a society and cultural show, and a lot of the themes that I try to touch on in the show is what is happening in our culture, what is about to happen in our culture. This is the third episode I've done related in some way directly with psychedelics. It's the first time I've talked to somebody who's actually running a center. And I would be curious, maybe as the last question, to get your thoughts about where you hope or where you think we are headed culturally with this. If as you look into the future, the next 3 to 5 years, what do you hope America looks like, the world looks like in terms of accessibility for these substances? Where do you think we're headed here?
I don't want to think about the very long term.
Sure.
I don't know what that would be like. I mean, I don't think it's a good idea for all people to have access to psychedelics at will without education, training, preparation. That may be a little curmudgeonly. I mean, I think people should understand what the experience will be, what they will experience. They should do it in a safe place with support. I don't believe there's any reason for these agents to be criminalized or anybody to suffer legal consequences for wanting to use them any more than they should for, all the other kinds of experiences we allow people to have, whether it's, alcohol or in many places cannabis now.
Yeah.
So what will the world look like? I focus narrowly on the world of psychiatry and medicine, and I want there to be new tools to help more people. And I'm hopeful that these will be available, accessible, and not overly burdensome in terms of cost, and that they will work at least somewhere in approximation to what the hype and promise is at this moment. As far as whether people should be able to just access them and get in their car and drive, it's challenging to try to strike the balance here.
Yeah.
How do you advocate for responsible and safe use, and then also allow people freedom to have experiences that they might want to seek, whether it's cliff diving or bungee jumping, people are allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So I'm cautious. I mean, and that's one reason I want to know more about what's going on in the brain, to know if it's safe, how to manage it if it goes awry, how to do it more efficiently and simpler and help more people. But I worry about a world of uncontrolled access to lots of substances, especially when they may be attractive alternative realities, and we can only imagine what that would be like.
Yeah, and maybe if I can slip one final question in, it dovetails to some degree into what you just spoke about. Is I think for a lot of people, these substances are rightly intimidating and kind of scary, especially if you have never done them before, don't know a lot about what the experience is like. When people come to you and ask you that question, how should I prepare for this trip, this journey, this experience? How do you describe that to them? What is going on experientially as a human being on these substances?
So I haven't had to do that. We actually, some of the team are trained, and they're the therapists who will do the preparation for the studies. But you're absolutely right. If you look at the videos of people going through this experience, they're pretty dramatic. And I've sometimes thought that all the commercial interest is a little optimistic, that a lot of humans are going to want to put themselves through this experience. There are certainly many who are desperate for it, but there'll be others who will be quite fearful and avoidant of, if they are told what they might experience or seen videos of people going through it. It may not, it's not going to sweep the nation.
Yeah.
But for people who are desperate and really suffering, I think they will overcome the fear of the experience. And then the good news is that, again, as I said, most people who have had a bad trip will actually say later that the experience was a positive one overall.
Yeah. Well, Jerry, I really appreciate the time. And I admire the work you guys are doing. I know it's early, but it just feels like there is something happening in the country to some degree related to these.
Change is coming.
Yeah.
This will be certainly part of our medical world or psychiatric world, but it'll be a growing passion and experience for lots of people. And maybe Rick's right. Maybe it'll shift humanity towards a more compassionate place.
Yeah, I hope so. I wish you the best of luck. It was really great to meet you.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you are finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/keeptalkingpodcast. I truly appreciate all of you who are supporting the show.